Dear students, welcome to Darasa Online. My name is Mr. Darcy. I teach English language. The lesson is on seeking and giving advice. Seeking and giving advice is a subtopic which is under speaking using appropriate language content and style. Now, seeking and giving advice is done by a person who qualifies and or who has a knowledge of a certain problem that a person asks. So maybe a question one has to ask himself is, what is an advice? An advice is an opinion or a recommendation that or which is offered to a person as a guide to an action and or to a conduct. It is normally given to a person with a problem. A person with a problem can be given an advice if he or she needs to, or if she asks for, and or sometimes a person can be given an advice without asking for a help. At the end of this lesson, it is expected that you, student, should be able to improve on the way how you can ask or you can seek for an advice, and or you should improve on the way you give advice to others. So through the whole discussion, we'll be guided by a question which reads, how can you seek and give advice? How can you seek and give advice? So seeking advice is done by a person with a problem. You cannot go and ask for an advice if you don't have a problem. And a person might sometimes not know if he or she has a problem by himself or by herself. So other people might start giving him an advice just by looking at maybe this fellow has, or this person is experiencing 1, 2, or 3 of the problems that they can see. Now the question is, why is it important for a person to seek for an advice? And why is it important for people to give advice to other people? It is important to seek for an advice because it makes you feel stronger, and it makes you become strong. Sometimes some people often tend to think that when a person seeks for an advice and seek for a help, in other words, that he or she is not qualified and he or she is weak. But the truth is that when you seek for advice, it does not mean that you are sick. You want yourself to become stronger enough to see how you can make other things move and how you can make the living better. So at this point, you should know that when a person seeks for an advice and when a person asks for a help, you need to know that this person has a problem. Now, having a problem does not mean that this person cannot solve his or her problem by himself or by herself. He or she has the answer to the problem that he or she has. So what he's doing, he is just asking, or he's just seeking for an advice to see how she or he can see the better way on how he or she can solve that problem. So in that case, these people don't believe to themselves. So they think of trying to see how they can make sure that what they think of handling the problem, it is the good way and or it is the same that other people could suggest and or could advise them to. But again, these people, they might ask for a problem so that they want to analyze the situation, that the way they could have handled the problem. Is it the same on how other people could handle the same problem? So a person may go to seek for an advice of a certain problem to another person, not to see how he or she can use that advice, but he or she is going there to see how could the same problem be analyzed and or be handled by other people. So he is going to use that knowledge to analyze the way how he could have done that, and so the way how other people did it. But again, these people or a person could seek for an advice just to gain more experience. What kind of an experience? An experience on how other people may make decisions. So it's like when someone advise and or when someone offer and or give some recommendation on how to handle a certain problem, and this person might take those advice, and end of the day he would find himself he is more experienced on how he or she can handle that problem. So in that case, you can use those advice as support to how you can handle your problem. So what I'm trying to say here is, when a person is seeking for advice, this does not mean that this person cannot handle that problem by himself or herself. The issue here is, this person, when he or she is seeking for advice, he or she wants to handle the problem in the right way. And seeing that the problem is handled in the right way, then this person becomes satisfied on how he or she can do things and or how he or she can pursue and or proceed with the remaining of his or her other activities. So maybe a question one might ask himself here is, have you ever asked for an advice? Certainly, it's no wonder that every one of us has already sought for an advice from other people. Or in other words, you ask for a help hand from another person. The question that I asked, have you ever asked yourself, why do people ask for advice but they don't use or they don't take it? That means you find a person has asked somebody or has gone to another person to seek for an advice because he or she has a certain problem that he or she is experiencing. But end of the day, this person do not follow the advice that he or she has been offered to. So that is the question I'm asking. And here again, you could think about, why do you think that a person with a problem cannot consult anybody? That there are people whom we consult for advices, but there are other people whom we never go for that. The question is, why? So sometimes people think that, oh, they just look at a person and say, oh, that person could probably help to give me a proper advice that I should follow. And you think of another person cannot do the same. So it is this reason that people have to choose a person who has to seek an advice for. Another question you could ask yourself is, why should you go for an advice if you cannot follow your own advice? Sometimes before I said that when people have problems, it's not that they don't have the answer to their problems. When they go for an advice, there are the things that they want to, as I said previously. But the answer that they have it is the advice that they have, or they have given themselves, or they have to give to themselves. So the question is, you go for advice to other people while you cannot advise yourself, and or you cannot follow your own advice. Because I thought it could have been better that you could have followed your own advice and see if it works towards the problem that you have. The funny thing is, why do people start going or start giving advice before they have been asked for? That you find yourself, yes, you have a problem, but you are just moving around, and someone whom either you might know him and or not, just call you and start giving you advice. Well, you have not asked that advice too. So it is this point that people sometimes, as we live in our societies, we find that probably you know a certain person has a problem, just the way he or she looks, and or the way he or she behaves, the way he or she acts. So it is at that time when people take that opportunity and say, okay, I think I should advise this other fellow, as I can see he or she is experiencing a certain problem. So as I said before, that people cannot go for advice if they don't have a problem. And so the same, that other people could see that you have a problem, but you don't seek for an advice, and therefore they react giving you an advice before you ask for it. So maybe the other question that you should ask yourself is, should I stop asking other people for advice? Now this question, should I stop asking other people for advice, it qualifies at that point on you know, or you have your own advice, but you cannot follow it. And sometimes you have a problem, you have not seek for an advice, but another fellow just see you have a problem, and so he or she has to advise you. And this is the reason as to why advice is important. Now here we go. How to ask advice. Now, as I said before, that you cannot go asking for advice if at all you don't have a problem. So when you are to ask for an advice, the first thing you need to know is to identify the advice that you are seeking. When I talk about identifying the kind of an advice that you are seeking, is that you have to analyze the problem that you have. You know, sometimes you might think that this is the problem that I have which I need to be advised. But the truth is, what you see is not the actual problem that you have. Think of a person, for example, that a person or a student might not want to go to school. Now, not going to school is a problem. And so you could find other people say, oh, could you please advise this boy that he or she does not want to go to school? But what is the problem that had made him not to like going to school? So it is at this point what I'm trying to say, that you have to be able to identify the kind of advice that a person seeks for. And in that case, when you go for an advice, you should be prepared for the specific details that you have with reference to the problem that you have. And if you have already identified which problem that you are facing. Now, when you have the details of the problem, this will help a person who will give you advice, and it will help yourself to see how you can do and how you can handle the problem that you are facing. And another thing is, not everybody should be consulted for. You have to identify the right person whom you have to consult. And as I said, sometimes that you can have a number of people that you know, and you have a problem that you want to seek an advice. So you cannot go to any. So you have to ask yourself, who should I consult so that he or she can give you an advice related to the problem that you are facing? And another thing is, do not assume that you know the answer. Of course, we at the beginning said that when a person has a problem, he or she knows where it came from, and he or she knows the answer to the problem. But we don't have to assume the answer that we have is the real or is the right one. The answer could have changed depending on how you will be advised. And so in that case, you find yourself that you are equipped with all the necessary things that let me go for. And so you have to be grateful for that. Now, how are you going to ask for? You know, we can have different expressions which a person can make as he or she asks for an advice. Before you give an actual expression of what do you want, you have to narrate the problem, or you have to mention the issue and or the problem that you are going for. And or after giving a picture or a situation, then you ask, what should I do? For example, one could come up with a problem like, you know, I have quarreled with my best friend simply because we had an appointment to do a certain task, and finally I failed to appear on that day of an appointment. So what should I do to sort out this problem with a friend? So that could be a problem that you are in conflict with your friend. And so you now ask another person to help and see what you can do. So you can say, what should I do? Oh, what do you suggest me to do? Oh, what is your advice? Oh, what is your suggestion? Oh, if you were me, what would you do? So this kind of expression, they can be made by a person who seeks advice. And especially, as I said, after he or she has mentioned the problem that he or she is facing. You want now a person whom you have consulted to say what should you do to handle the problem in a right way. So those could be expressions. Now, when a person has already been asked what he or she should do so that he or she can help a person who has consulted. Yeah, at times, as we say, that when you already have been consulted for an advice, someone needs you to tell something. Someone needs your recommendation on how he or she is going to handle the problem. So it is at this time when you are to turn yourself and see how can you give advice. So giving advice, it has to be done by a person who knows how to handle different issues, and who is experienced enough over several situations. So it is at this time when this person has to think, should he give the advice? And should he think of giving an advice without giving advice? So there are two things here. Giving advice and giving advice without giving advice. So you can ask yourself, what does this mean by giving advice without giving advice? So you give advice, or you give advice without giving advice. The difference here is, when you give advice, it is when you give the suggestion of what a person should do. You give a recommendation on what a person should do with regard to the problem that he or she is experiencing. In other words, you are telling him what he has to do or what she has to do. But giving advice without giving advice, this is when you stand or when you sit with a person with a problem, and what you do, you are trying to encourage that person to see how best he or she can reach to a solution by himself or by herself. So you are there only to lead and or to guide how he or she can handle the problem that he or she has. As I said some times back, that when a person goes for an advice, he or she has the answer already, and only that. Maybe he is not sure of what he knows. So he goes for advice to see if what he or she is going to be advised, could it be the same, and could he get a different alternative? So he might have several alternatives. So you, as a person who has to offer advice, and so in that case, when you want to give an advice to such a person, then at the end of time, you might give different alternatives to see which one he or she can choose to act for. I'll come to that later. So when you are to give advice, what should you do? There are some steps here, or there are some alternatives that you can choose of which one you should take. The first one is, we are told that you should give an advice through a use of a sentence that suggests or that gives suggestion. And when you give such kind of sentences or expressions, we normally use modal auxiliary verbs. And the modal verbs that we normally use here, they are words like should and ought to. So when you use should and ought to in your expression, mostly these sentences, they are trying to show that you are suggesting a person should use this method and or should do 1, 2, 3 in order to sort out and or to solve a problem that he or she has. For example, this person works for long hours, maybe as from 6 up to 5 p.m. So many hours are spent as he or she works, and he or she becomes very tired and probably find himself, he has headache in that matter. Seeking advice on what he or she should do, you could give an expression like, you ought to sleep for many hours. In other words, you ought to have a rest. Oh, you should reduce the working hours. So those are such expressions which you can give. But when I talk about modal verbs here, like when I talk of modal verbs like should and ought to, I don't mean that these are the only modal verbs that we have in a language. We have other words, or we have a list of other words which they are also known as modal verbs, which in fact we don't apply them when we give advice. They are used in different other sentences that suggest different things. May I go out? The use of may in that sentence. Can I play football? Can. It will rain next week. Will. You must do this. Must shows obligation. And you can mention several others like might, should, would, shall, and so on and so forth. Now, this is one of. You try to give a suggestion by the use of modal verbs. But not all the time you can give a sentence that suggests. You can also sometimes give a recommendation by trying to put yourself in the person's position. And it is useful to imagine yourself being in his or her position simply because at that time that person might feel that you are trying to experience or you are also experiencing the same problem that he or she has. If I were you. If I were you. So you are trying or you are creating a situation that you also experiencing the problem that he or she has. So you say, if I were you. Of course, you are not the one. So you are trying to put yourself on his position, on or her position, and see how you can suggest and how you could have handled that problem. That if I were you, I could reduce the working hours. If I were you, I would reduce the working hours. So I was referring to the problem of the other person who is experiencing headache problem just because of the time he spends in working. So I have decided to place myself in his position. If I were you, I could have done 1, 2, 3. So this is another way that you are giving a direct advice but trying to position yourself on his or her side. And another one is you have to give suggestions or recommendations on how you can do it. And you don't give a direct one that you should ask somebody maybe do 1, 2, 3, 4. No. Try to give several options. You start with, I suggest that you could do something like this. What I'm trying to say here is, when you want to make a suggestion, don't say, reduce working hours. That is more direct. Just say something like, I suggest that you reduce the working hours. So you have to make a statement which is a bit polite and is trying like you are trying to ask a person to think about doing it. But you are not directly telling him. Because mind you, when you tell somebody directly without making a sentence or a statement that gives a suggestion, that person, if he or she is going to act on what you tell, then when it fails, the blames becomes on you. So when you give a suggestion like, I suggest you reduce the working hours. So if, on the other hand, there might happen that the problem has not been handled properly, then when the person comes back, you say, okay, I just suggested, I didn't say that you should do this. So this is the reason why we say you have to make a suggestion. But there are times a person might come with a problem. And when you look at the problem, that you find it has reached to a critical point. So it is at this time when you have to advise by giving a stronger statement. We talk about you give an advice by using a stronger way. And how do we do that? At that time, it is when you have to give a direct statement. And maybe something that you had better do this, or you had better, for example, reduce the working hours. And or if another person have another problem, like maybe they have a quarrel or a family problem, then a person could say, okay, you had better travel for several times, or you had better join the jogging club. That could probably help. And what I'm trying again to say here is, when a person is approached by another person seeking for a help, then he or she has to see which way he or she should use out of those that we have mentioned. Now, this is how to give advice. But on the other hand, I said there's a way that you want to give an advice without giving advice. And this is one of the recommended style anyway. That you have to give and you have to see, you have to guide a person to see how he or she can lead to the solution of his or her problem. How do we go about that? The first thing is when someone approaches you seeking for advice, and or when you think I should advise this person, the first thing is you have to know the problem that he or she is experiencing. He would tell the problem. Now, after you have been told the problem, then try to ask several questions with regard to the problem, and also try to see the feelings that a person has towards the problem that he or she is experiencing. Now, for example, here comes a person, tells you that I don't like my job. Then you say, oh, what? You say, I don't like my job. Oh, I'm not happy with my job. So, a person could think of, if you are not, or if you don't like your job and you're not happy for it, then you have to quit maybe. This person could think about, no, quit. Now, when you quit for the job, look, how are you going to earn? So it is at this point when a person has to think of what is the problem with the job and how do you feel about it? Those are kind of questions that you might ask yourself at the beginning. Because if you ask a person to go back to school and so that he or she can change the job, that's not a right way of handling the problem. So giving advice without giving advice, the first thing is you ask questions with regard to the problem that a person the person is experiencing. So you could ask a question like, what about your job? How do you feel about it? So this person could start narrating and or could start giving out what happens to his or her job. So this person, as he or she answers, he could talk about, I love my job, but it takes long hours. So here comes the two answers, that he or she loves the job, but it takes long hours. So from there you know, so the problem is not about the job. The problem here is about the long hours that this person works. So in that case, you could start now thinking about, how is he going to handle this? Try to think about the alternative way on how he or she can handle the problem. Keep on asking questions if at all he has consulted the employer about this, and or if they could change that working hours. So look at all these possibilities, then you finally find this person comes with a solution on what he or she is experiencing. So you'd find that after asking questions, you came to realize the problem is not the first that has been mentioned, but there was a real problem somewhere in the middle, and how you could handle that, it will depend on what other questions that you can ask him. Maybe we would come to it when it comes to the model questions that are going to be displayed sometimes. Now, after asking questions, you have to give, or you have to put some good qualities. You have to give positive qualities about the person who has come for an advice, so that you can build confidence to him. And when you talk about positive qualities, you're talking about some good things, the things that you think he or she can do. You know, sometimes people are not confident by themselves. So when you give those positive qualities, you can in fact make them gain the confidence. And in that case, they can see, okay, oh, I can do it. So maybe you tell about a person is not doing well in his or her classes. And there you're a teacher or a counselor being approached by. What kind of positive qualities could you give? You could try to talk about the intelligence that he or she has. You talk about the discipline. But all these, you have to put them in a positive way. So when you give these positive qualities, it is at this point when this person would feel that he or she can do that thing. And that becomes one of a help. You have not given the solution to, but you have decided to tell him the things that he has for him to build a confidence and think of how he or she can apply the answers that he or she has. But sometimes again, you can decide to make stories, or you can decide to share the stories that could offer an alternative perspective. And this story has to relate with the problem that he has. So in other words, you are trying like to show the problem that you're experiencing is not the only one that you had it before. There are other people who had similar problems. But at this point, we are asked, we should not tell a story of our own. That you have to try to refer to how other people did the same. That the same thing happened to one of our colleagues who was living somewhere, and he handled this problem in this and this and this. So at the end of the day, he could think himself that the problem that he or she is experiencing is very minor and it's very little. So it is at that time when this person could see what I'm experiencing, I'm not alone. There are several others who had experienced the same thing. But all in all, again, when you are through with all this, then you can even also decide to offer options. That this is a problem, yes. How could this problem be handled? So you could give alternatives on the way how this person can do it. This is the way how you can give advice. Remember, when we give advice, we don't give advice to a person who has no problem. There must be a problem somewhere, or there has to be an issue to be addressed. And you address it by being asked, and or sometimes without being asked, depending on how do you see the situation goes. That now we have discussed on how we can ask for advice and how a person can give advice. Let us now try to look at the model questions that I prepared for you. The first question and or situation that could make a person seek for an advice could be like, imagine that you have been appointed as a school counselor and there comes a student who cannot concentrate in classes because he used to sleep immediately after the lessons begin. Think of how you can advise the student. This is a situation. Now, you're taught to imagine as a counselor. So there are two things here that you can think about: a person who is to be advised, and in that case, he or she can go to seek for advice and see how the counselor can advise. So there is seeking and giving at the same position. So it is a student who has to seek for advice, and it is a counselor who has to give the advice. And in this case now, what is the problem? So we should identify the problem that the student is experiencing. Now, when you read this situation, you talk about a student who cannot concentrate in class. Why? He used to sleep immediately after the lessons begin. Now, that is the problem. Here comes a student saying, I cannot concentrate in class. That I normally sleep all the time immediately when the lesson begins. So, as an advisor, how are you going to help this? That you can decide to use the two options we had. Either you give advice, or you give advice without giving advice. In other words, you can give a direct advice, or you can give the advice indirectly. Indirectly, it's like you're trying to explore the problem that he has by asking him several questions, and which end of the day you identify the particular problem that he or she is experiencing. Because as we can see, concentrating in class, could this be a problem? Why? Sleeps immediately after the lesson begins. Could sleeping after the lesson begins be a problem? You could start maybe asking, if you are to give advice indirectly, you could start asking questions about his concentration. Maybe, do you like the subject? Or do you like the classes or the lessons? Now, when the answer becomes, yes, I like the lessons, then the question there comes, why do you have to sleep? Then he could talk about, I don't know why. I find myself, I'm already asleep. Then ask him or her, at what time does he or she goes to bed? At night. So the answer that you're going to get, it could probably one of the reasons that why he has or why she sleeps when he or she gets in class. Try also to ask if he or she does several domestic activities at home or sometimes in the dormitory. And those activities find him becomes tired. And those problems or those activities makes him tired. And my friend, if you are tired, definitely you cannot think of doing other things, but instead you need to rest. And probably when sometimes a person might be bored with a certain topic or with some certain classes. So it is possible also that you have to ask, does he or she sleeps in all the lessons? And as it reads here, in sleeps after the lessons begin. So you talk about lessons, definitely it's probably all the lessons. But as we said, you have to ask several questions as you could see how this person can reach to the actual problem that he or she has. And from there, you start act on that particular problem that you would finally reach. And as we said, you could offer several alternatives to see which one he or she is going to take in order to solve and or to have a solution to what he or she is experiencing. But also, as we said, you can decide even to give a direct answer for that, or a direct advice. And or you can think about putting yourself on the side of the students. In that you put yourself on his position. If I were you, I could or I would sleep early at night. If I were you, I would ask my mother to reduce the activities that I do at night. If I were you, I would have enough rest. If I were you, you could think of any possibility that could make this person concentrate in class. That could be one. And so, as I say, you can think about several other options. You give positive qualities, what he or she has, that other students also possess. You can decide to give a story of another person who had the same habit of sleeping and how he or she finally handled it. Let's go to this other model question. The question reads, your friend has approached you to advise on how he or she can cope with lessons. He lately has discovered that she or he spends most of her or his time on watching television. Which advice would you give him or her? Again, here we have a person having a problem and consulting another person to see how he or she can recommend. Ask a person to see what he or she can say to solve and or to help solving the problem. Now, as you are approached, you need first of all to analyze and or to identify the problem. What is the problem? The problem here is, as it reads from the board, the problem is this person cannot cope with lessons. And why? It is because he spends most of his time or her time in watching television. So, you have to ask yourself, what is the real problem that you need to address? Because if you think about how he or she can cope with lessons, then you have to think about this person has to spend much of his or her time in studies. Now, if he spends most of his or her time in watching television, then definitely he won't have time for studies. So, in your advice, whether you give it direct and or indirect, you have to think about the time he spends in watching television is not worthy. Try ask, does he or she likes all the program from morning to evening? You might find this person is in love only in one of the program. You might find this person likes only one of the program in TV. So in that case, you have to ask this person, at what particular time this program you like is presented. Maybe if he or she is not sure of the time, that's why he has to stay for long watching television, then you have to ask him. He has to be sure on the timetable or the programs when they are shown in their TV. So at that particular time, he would point out this is the particular hour that he or she has to go for a television. And in that case, the remaining other hours, then he or she could use them for what? For studies. Thank you very much for listening. Keep on watching Darasa Online.